everyone, and I live in Mildura in Victoria, which is a pretty hot place, so thanks for making me welcome and turning the heater on outside. Makes me feel just like at home. But also it's a good venue with air conditioning. We like our air conditioning in Mildura. So we've got a bit to talk about today, and I knew I wasn't going to get it all, so as much as I could, I put an article in the little booklet for today. So we're not going to cover off on all of that, but there's plenty of information there that's sort of the greatest hits, I suppose, when it comes to amelioration and pulses that I've sort of learned over the last decade or so. And contact details are there. More than happy to. This is all funded by you guys at some point, whether it's GOC or SAGIT or something like that. So more than happy to take phone calls and send data through. And if you don't get the first time, then pester me again, and I'll send it through. So just a rough region where we sort of do most of our work. You've got Mildura up there in the top corner, Adelaide down here in the bottom, and we sort of try to cover that whole Mallee region across that sort of zone. Just had a new person come into our business, which I'm sure is familiar to you guys, is Jason Brand, one of the leading pulse researchers in Australia. He's now working with us, and so we're anticipating doing more work in the future in that sort of Wimmera region as well. So the first thing, I guess this will be the concentration today, is amelioration and what it means for pulse crops in particular. But just to sort of set the scene a little bit, the majority of the research that we've sort of undertaken has been quite specifically to sandy soils. I guess that was our charter, that was the issue we're trying to target. Lots of people performing, look, our sands just aren't performing well, the soil types in the paddock, what do we need to do about it? And when you look at a sandy soil, I guess you can look at it as a whole, this is underperforming sandy soil, or you can start to break it down and say, well, what are the constraints in that soil that are holding back the plant? And I think this is quite relevant in terms of going from area to area. I'm going to talk about my experience in the Mallee today, and you guys are going to have sandy soils, and they might be, a lot different to ours, or could be some differences, there could be similarities. But for us, what we've sort of come down to is breaking down those constraints to what is the constraint in the soil, and largely they're categorised. Do they have high soil strength? This term bounces around a bit. Is it compaction, soil strength, hard setting? Let's think of it as, are the roots restricted from getting deep into the soil and exploring that soil? That's what we're talking about there. Is the soil non-wetting? Usually that's only, if you've got non-wetting, it's constrained to the very surface of the soil, as affects with germination, affects herbicide movement through the soil, affects weed germination, a whole heap of issues associated with that. But again, in a lot of our soils, we don't have that non-wetting constraint, and it's the high soil strength where we're getting the benefits from addressing. Soil acidity, this is something that's really starting to pop up for us, probably as a result of overcoming the high soil strength. We're going, well, our soils are non-wetting, why is this patch not performing? Starting to go out there, and we think it's a relatively new thing, but it's on the sands that don't have any sort of buffering capacity. They don't have limestone, they don't have enough clay in them. And when we grow a crop, it's an acidifying process. So actually starting to find patches with quite bad acidity. It's also coming from introducing the legumes in the system, because the acidity levels, why they have quite low pH, we're not really finding aluminium in the soil. In the cereal system, aluminium is what attacks and kills off the roots. But if you've got low pH, it's enough to kill the nitrogen-taxing bacteria that cause our nodulation. So in legume crops, these patches are showing up. And we know we've also got soil nutrition there. I guess the thing for soil nutrition, you've got all sorts of, the way to address nutrition for us on the sand hasn't been any real difference from the past. I think the thing that you need to think about is if you go and ameliorate your sands, you've got a much higher yield potential than you've definitely had. So some of the jobs where we haven't been successful for amelioration, we can look back on those and say, well, we just didn't put enough nitrogen in to meet that new demand, or we haven't got enough phosphorus there to meet that new demand. So when it comes to soil nutrition, all the old rules apply. You just got to think about, well, what's the new yield potential we're trying to target. And the critical thing to all this is diagnosing what is your problem in the soil. One project we worked on, there's quite a few soils on the EP from here, and I've put some QR codes on the tables there. We've developed Soil Hub. So Soil Hub's a heap of representative soils that you can get in there, see the soil pit, understand what's happening in it. But importantly, we've tried to, Mel Fraser has been a big part of this project, and we've tried to sort of do some training videos and give you an idea of how you can go about looking at those constraints yourself. So I said at the start, our charter has really been around the deep sands, and the trials that we have done, we haven't done a lot of trial work off there, but we've seen that the responses we're getting to things like deep ripping are really being are specific to those sandy soils with the current ripping setups that we use for our sandy soils. If you go off too far down the mid-slope or where the sand's running out, we're not seeing those same responses. So the responses have been quite specific to sandy soils. This isn't to say that amelioration approaches couldn't benefit other soil types, and an example of this is in southern New South Wales. The soil types are much more a redder, flatter soil, sandy loams, but without that real deep sand. And they tried to take some learnings of the deep ripping on sandy soils and apply it to those paddocks, and they had a disaster. Trafficability was poor, didn't give them any crop response, because they were trying to take a ripper set up for deep ripping sandy soils and put it onto a soil type, and they were just totally missing the mark with the constraint there. But what that country has is it's been farmed very traditionally for a long period of time. A lot of what you traditionally calls plough pan compaction, so the compaction is in that sort of 10 to 20 centimetre zone. So now they've gone out there with deep rippers, but they're only trying to rip to 20 centimetres, and also they've got a more appropriate ripper, which is much closer time spacing, and they're having a lot of success by addressing that constraint on that soil. So it's not a sand, it's got a constraint to production. They've identified that constraint and they've used the right tool to try and fix it, and now they're having a lot of success. The holy grail, I guess, would be to map and identify these constraints in a precision ag form. We've had a bit of a go at the moment. The best recommendations is use some data to support your intuition. If you think there's somewhere that's not performing well, go into those zones, do some soil testing, do some soil pits, have a look what it is. Maybe use some spatial maps to help, which is yield maps, EM38, NDVI, and in the best case scenario, start to do some test strips to see whether you're getting a response. This whole mapping and where and when to start ameliorating in the paddock is a big focus of our new research. There's some guys in the room from CSI Road today, so that's going to be a big focus in different areas over the next 3 or 4 years to try and come up with a better way to actually try and map these paddocks for where these constraints are and how we can tackle them. This is probably the best data I have. Pretty comprehensive trial looking at where to rip in the paddock. This was actually a series of 25 trials going from the top of the hill down to a flat. So Mallee environment, our issue, and I'm sure it happens over here, is you get all the soil types within the one paddock. It's very hard to say we're going to rip that paddock and we're not going to rip that one. It's the soil types within them. And you can see here, this trial ran over 3 years. We had barley in the first year, chickpeas in the second year, and wheat in the third year. And in the first slide is how the barley performed in the first year. So you can see that, for the first, and these were about 12 metre long plots. So the first 100 metres or so, we got a really good ripping response. But then how quickly it happened, that ripping response dropped off. And once we got to the bottom of the mid-slope and into the heavy soil, we're actually getting a negative response from deep ripping. So really important to think about where you're going to go in that paddock, because for all the benefit that you're getting on top of the hill, you can start eating into that benefit very quickly once you're starting to get off soil types that aren't responding or actually having a negative effect. And we put together the ripping gross margin benefits, and this is the extra benefit above the gross margins of the control treatment. And you can see over that 3-year period, three reasonable years, but and it had a high value crop like chickpeas in there. But yeah, where we got those ripping responses, we were up to $1,000 better off on those parts of the paddock, much less once you get down onto the soil types that didn't need to be ripped. So when it comes to, for us, deep ripping, what are we trying to do? Alleviate that high soil strength. And that has shown some really big benefits across a whole range of crops, so wheat, barley, but also our pulses, and probably more so our pulses. Every pulse except for lupins, we've found has responded really well to deep ripping. Let's say loosening the soil, allowing the roots to proliferate through the soil across our Mallee sands. Deep ripping's loosening the soil profile to reduce penetration resistance. So penetration resistance is diagnosed with penetrometer. And what we find in our sands is there's a high bulge of penetration resistance between 15 to 20 centimetres down to about 40 to 50 centimetres. And then it sort of, as you get more clay in the soil, the penetration resistance sort of dissipates. And I guess from a consistency point of view, what we've found is those guys that go out and rip on an appropriate ripper to that sort of 40 to 50 centimetres are much better off than those guys that go out there and rip into 30 centimetres. So the guys that go out and rip on 30, sometimes it works really well, sometimes it doesn't. I've just found in my experience that if you're targeting that 450 to 500, it's a much more reliable result across the paddock.
10 minutes.
Yep. So when the rip, some of the coming into that is what are the soil conditions that are suitable. So you need some sort of moisture in the soil for it to be suitable. The critical thing is that ripping time should be spaced relatively equal to the depth you're trying to target. And that comes back to my New South Wales story before. You're targeting at 500. The ripping times can be spaced at 500. If you're only targeting 300, then those times need to be sort of closer again. But there's opportunities to improve that, and that's some work we did last year, which is starting to look at wings, inclusion plates. What are other things we can add to the ripper to improve the setup so it can be done more cost effectively? And the trial we had at Cokeville last year, we worked with the University of South Australia on this. On the top left hand, that's a pretty standard ripper to the trials that we've been talking about. Straight shake tine. Importantly, we're not trying to disturb the surface because we haven't got non-wetting issues that we're targeting. We're just trying to loosen that soil profile. You can see over there we can change the ripper setup by adding wings. So that's basically improving the area that's been ripping. That can either do a better loosening job or it can actually allow us to push our tine spacings out wider, get a cheaper ripping job, and also do it more efficiently and on a wider machine. Also looking at inclusion plates, we think that they could offer some benefits in terms of longevity of that ripping response. So try to prevent that recompaction from forming. Last year, just showing you that the different types of rippers did have an impact on yield. So the farmer's Bednar gave a good response, but it was pretty equivalent to the standard ripper. But when we go out and loosen the soil profile even more, we're starting to get extra sort of yield benefits from there. We looked at some profitability numbers, and just depending on your ripper setup, if you went for a standard setup, including, and we're able to measure fuel use and stuff like that. Basically you've taken the profit in that year from say $66 per hectare from a standard ripping setup. But if you start to look at how you set up the machine, some of the attachments that you might put on, we've been able to double that in that 1 year. Ripping with inclusion plates giving us about $120 per hectare extra gross margin. than just ripping alone. I've talked a lot about the loosening soils, and yes, we do have the non-wetting soils in certain spots, particularly South Australia and Mallee. Just want to talk you through some really good, sort of observations here. There's a whole heap of approaches that you might be able to use, and they're not all amelioration approaches. So on-row sowing has always proved to be pretty good. Soil wetters have proved to be effective, but with both of those, there's some real implementation challenges. How you do it in variable environments, how you control your seeders. Like I said before, low disturbance ripping doesn't really do anything for non-wetting because you're not mixing that soil profile. But topsoil mixing through spading, ripping with inclusion plates, plozza plows, those sort of things have sort of shown some benefit. The biggest turn-off, I guess, for our Mallee farmers has been the erosion risk that some of these provide. Just to highlight some data from a trial we had at Young Husband. This is looking at where we've got multiple constraints in the same paddock. So where we had non-wetting issue to come across, and also where we got benefits from reducing that high soil strength. So on the right-hand side, we've got different options and that's the effect of the plant population. And then in 2021, we've got what's the effect on the wheat yield in that particular year. So you can see there the control yield was only 0.9 of a tonne per hectare, and the plant population was very low. It was very variable, but it was around 20 plants per metre squared. If we go on-row sowing, or we use soil wetters, they were very good at getting the plant establishment up, but the benefit from a yield point of view was only about 0.3 to 0.4 tonnes per hectare. If we just ripped, so we loosened the soil but we didn't improve this plant establishment, we also got about that half a tonne per hectare yield benefit. Because if you look on the chart, and this pointer doesn't work on the TV, sorry. The ripping also had very low plant numbers. So yes, we got a benefit from loosening that soil, but we didn't get that other event. But if we look at things like spading or ripping with inclusion plates, both of those done a really good job a pretty good job of getting the plant population back up to our target level, but we also got that benefits from the soil loosening. And there we can see that we've put on 1.1 to 1.2 tonne per hectare extra yield in that particular year because we've addressed both constraints simultaneously. And just to show you what happened, the next year what we did is we actually split the trial site up, and we grew lupins on one half of the trial, lentils on the other, and now we're getting into this, what I was talking about before, the crop response specific to the different constraints. So I haven't got the establishment data up there, but we saw similar trends across the treatments for establishment, probably not as severe as what we saw in 2021. On the left-hand side, we've got what the lupin grain yield was. On the right-hand side, we've got the lentil grain yield. So if you look, this was 2022, and I'm sure everyone knows what that was like. We had some amazing yield potential with double our growing season rainfall in spring, but even still, you can see control inter-row and just ripping alone has had a slight suppression of yield on our lupins because they're the ones that didn't get the establishment as well as the other treatments. But we also know that lupins don't really respond to loosened soil. And I guess why is that? Well, lupins are growing on their sand all the time, and why do we grow lupins on their sand? They must have some sort of mechanism that is able to deal with this high soil strength constraint in the soil. Must be part of why they're beneficial on sands. 5 or finish? 5. Yep, that's better than finish. But if you look in the contrast to the lentil yield, one of the things that have really responded from the lentil, and remember this is actually the third year after our implementation of our amelioration treatments. So the things that drove increases in lentil yield were the deep ripping inclusion plates and spading. So all those actions that we did 3 years ago that loosened the soil have had the biggest benefit in grain yield, and in some cases, 3 years on, have actually increased the lentil yield by a factor of 3, taking it from half a tonne up to nearly 1.5 tonnes. And that's been a pretty consistent message across a lot of trials that we've done. So this is a lot of trials that we did from this period, 2019 to 22. There's probably more data I can check in there, but it gives a similar sort of story. What we've got here is pulled apart from a whole bunch of trials what the non-rip grain yield was on the bottom and what the rip grain yield was on the top. And again, anything that sits on that 1-to-1 line, which is that line going through the middle, means that yield was equal in non-ripped and ripped situations. And what sticks out there, well, lupins are sitting along, so we get no benefit out of our lupins. But we look at all the other crops. We've got lentils, chickpeas, field peas, vetch and fava beans. They all sit a long way above that line. And these soil types are the type of soils that they sort of, no matter what you do, you're sort of only getting about a half a tonne yield out of a lot of these legumes in most years. And you can see there we've got the average yield benefit. Well, the average yield benefit in lentils has been half a tonne. But things like chickpeas, field peas, vetch and fava beans, they've all been nearly up at that 1 tonne mark across benefit across those sort of trials. That's the sort of average. Sometimes you'll see a half a tonne benefit, but sometimes we've seen a 2 tonne benefit as well. So this depends on the seasonal conditions. But you can really start to see the value of high value pulses if we're starting to get these sort of yield benefits out of it. So something like chickpea there, the average yield benefit at 1.1 tonne per hectare. The average grain price for chickpeas across that period was $6.43. So all of a sudden you're up to a $600 hectare benefit from that operation. And I reckon you could buy a hell of a lot of ripping for $600 a hectare. With the lentils, the yield benefit's been a bit suppressed. I don't have the exact knowledge. What my feeling is in a lot of these sands, it isn't a high salinity, but the salinity or the salts on these sands are really available to the plant. And sometimes you get soil tests back from APAL because we get all the texture readings done as well as the EC 1 to 5. Sometimes they're up around 2 or even a bit more in that sort of topsoil. So my feeling is there's a bit more work to do in salinity tolerance on lentils to sort of be able to express their full effect. But even still, $700 a tonne at half a tonne is 312. And this is why I sort of advocate that if you can, you know, what we usually see in our amelioration research is that you get the biggest bang for buck in that first year after amelioration. And I think some of that to do is accumulated water and nutrients and other things that have been in the profile that haven't been used until we access them and make them available to the crop. So my question is if we're getting a half a tonne benefit in lentils, you know, at $700 a tonne, is that better than getting a half a tonne or even a tonne benefit in something like barley that's worth a lot lower sort of margin? So we've actually seen that in the Mallee. There's sort of 2 camps. Some are very hesitant to go in with a pulse straight after an amelioration phase, but there's other guys out there, particularly in the Victorian Valley, that are embracing it. They're getting the system right, and they're having a lot of success by growing these pulse crops straight after that sort of ripping phase. So that's a bit of a snapshot. There's a lot more information there, but I'll hand it over to Bill and maybe we can address any more things for some questions.
Michael, that was great. I reckon that's a really good presentation. Thanks for that. And I'm sure there's lots more to discuss. I just want to pull it up there because I reckon that's where a lot of us are at. There's a lot of ripping going on. There's a lot of interest in lentils. You know, we've got the lentil goggles on, haven't we? But maybe there's opportunities with other crops we perhaps overlooking and need to revisit in some of this. So what I'm going to do is just ask you to have a chat at your tables about the questions I want you to consider. I am going to put them up on the screen to tick. But how can we take the learnings from the Mallee and apply them in this region? That's the first question. And then what more information do you need?